All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Julie and I'm the events manager at Roundabout Books. We are so excited that during this time of quarantine that we are able to have these virtual events, that you have joined us, and I'm sure a lot of people are maybe zoomed out at this point, but we're so grateful that you've taken this time on this beautiful Saturday afternoon, and so grateful for authors for being available for these Zoom events. So I just want to remind everyone that the store is open. We're open daily right now, 10 to 5. You can call in and grab a book. We can have you pay for it over the phone. We have a red bench that you can pick it up in the front of the store so you don't have to come inside if you're not comfortable with that. And we always offer shipping as well. So we just want to say thank you again for everyone who's been supporting Roundabout for these last, 8 months of this unprecedented time, and continues to do so. So I'm really excited about this book. For anyone who's here locally in Central Oregon, you know that it did start snowing the last couple of days, so we are finally in winter. And so this book is kind of very apropos right now. So if you're not familiar with it, this is the wonderful cover of This Land of Snow by Anders Morley. And I just wanted to read a short bio. The author has worked as an English teacher and a translator, and splits his time between Littleton, New Hampshire and Bergamo, Italy, which is actually where he's joining us from today. And this book is both memoir and adventure story, and in my opinion, after reading just a little bit of it, kind of an ode to the beauty that is winter and snow, and this northern hemisphere that we're very close to Canada still. I love Canada. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Anders, and just let's talk about your book. I'm so excited for this.
All right. Well, thank you, Julie, and thank you to Roundabout Books in general for the opportunity to talk about my book. And thank all of you for coming, especially those of you who are in Oregon, where you said it's a beautiful day and it's the middle of a Saturday when you could be out doing more interesting things, perhaps. Anyway, I hope that my talk is interesting enough to have made it worth your while. So the book is called This Land of Snow, and the place is as much a subject of the book as the journey itself, but also the season. And I think of it as a journey across a physical space, but also a journey across the season. Basically, to give you the gist of the book, I spent 4 months traveling on cross-country skis across northwestern Canada. It was 7 or 8 years ago. It was the winter of 2012 and 2013. One of the big questions, so the book is really a travel memoir rather than just a travel log. So it's the memoir is as important as the description of the journey itself, because I thought that the reasons I was making the journey were self-evident. Like, I just wanted to go on an adventure in the wintertime. That turned out not to be the case, because the question of why kept nagging. And so one of the threads that runs through the book is my trying to come to terms with why I had decided to make this journey that everyone I met thought was so strange. Why would you want to go out and sleep in 40 below weather for 4 months? So what I want to do is kind of invert the way that these things are normally done, and begin with a few readings that home in on one of the themes that runs through the book. And but first, let me give you a bit of background on the theme. So I grew up in New Hampshire, and I studied history in university. I've always been very drawn to the past. I won't say I have a reverence for the past, but I've always had this sense of history and something drawing me back towards the old world, to use kind of an old-fashioned term. And I think I think of that as typical of New England, which is the old part of the New World. So there's this so there have always been these two forces pulling at me. One pulling me back towards Europe, where I've spent much of my adult life. My wife is Italian, and that's an important part of the story. But then I've always been very drawn west. And it's obviously, it's kind of an imaginary west, you know, like the Horace Greeley, who first said "Go west, young man," is from my hometown of Amherst, New Hampshire, and maybe that's what planted the seed of sort of this myth as the west of this land of where everything was. I mean, obviously, it's not really the way it is, but everything is sort of new and fresh, and it's this blank slate. So by the time I was in my early 30s, and I had a pretty good life and I was happily married, but there was something that seemed missing. And so this idea of not only the North, but also the Northwest as sort of a blank slate to recreate myself was very alluring. So what I want to do is read, I think, 3 passages that kind of trace the development of my thinking, beginning with this pretty naive notion, and then kind of going through a middle phase, and then coming to a resolution, which won't spoil the book. Don't worry, even though the readings are from different parts of the book. So what I want to begin with a passage from the 2nd chapter, which is actually a diary entry that is in the book. And it's a diary entry that I wrote while I was in Italy, about a month before I set off on the journey. And my wife, who is Italian and very much an urbanite, was not convinced that this journey into the icy wild was a very good idea, and so it led to a good deal of strife between us, which is part of the book. So I'll just read it as it's written, like a diary entry. September the 24th, 2012, Bergamo, which is the city in Italy where I live, part of the time lived. Yesterday, Ellen and I went for a hike from home up to a prospect overlooking the small town of Olera. Even here, I have a hard time using the word village because of the layout of even the smallest Italian communities. They're like shrunken cities, differing from their giant counterparts only quantitatively. The smallest Italian town up in the mountains is a dense cluster of brick, stone, and cement. It may have a population of 30, but its population density will be exactly 30 persons per acre, and you will hear your neighbors arguing, and the barking of their dogs will resound off the stone walls of the house across the narrow lane, so that it sounds as if the dog is barking 6 inches from your ear. There are bars on all the lower windows. Anyway, up on this prospect, a few hundred meters above the town, was a shrine, the endpoint of a grueling Via Crucis that climbs up from the valley floor. The shrine is emblematic of the European and perhaps especially Italian understanding of history and material culture that I've been contrasting with those of the original peoples of North America. One finds a solid little shrine built of stone and cement with a terracotta roof. Behind its barred window, shut with an armored padlock, is a portrait of the obscure object of devotion, Tommaso Acerbis, Capuchin friar, born Olera, 1563, died Innsbruck, 1631, called the Mystic Heart of Jesus, whatever that means. So this fellow lived 400 years ago, along with hundreds of thousands of others, and probably very few people, even in his little hometown, know anything about him. And who can say how much of what is known is apocryphal? Yet here is his monument, lest we forget him. Why not give our attention to virtuous things or people of our own times about which we can know something useful? But apart from the permanence of the building and the attempts of certain humans to make the man's reputation permanent, there are the devotional knickknacks, fake flowers and a light bulb candle. Fake flowers because real ones wither and die. Fake candles because real ones melt away and burn out, perhaps both things that poor Father Acerbis in his memory ought to be allowed to do in peace. I read, perhaps in Paulette Giles's North Spirit, Sojourns Among the Cree and Ojibwe, that native cultures in Northern Ontario do not remember individuals for more than about 3 generations. I think you can sense this layer of kind of misanthropy and unhappiness in my tone in that entry. And that was kind of the mood I was in when I set off on this journey. So it was kind of like I was lashing out at something, which it wasn't entirely clear what. So now this next bit, this is a short section from the first chapter, but so it's chronologically later than what I just read. And it's me arriving in Prince Rupert, which is in northwestern British Columbia. It's the northernmost Canadian town on the Pacific, just south of the Alaska Panhandle. And I think there's this enthusiasm in it, which is in stark contrast with what I just read. So to give you some context, I've just been dropped. I've just come off of a boat that took me up from Vancouver Island to this town, a 22-hour ferry ride, which took me up to the top of British Columbia. And I'm getting a lift into the town of Prince Rupert to spend the night before setting off on my journey. They dropped me off at the Pioneer Hostel, where I had stayed once more than a decade earlier. The year after university, I hitchhiked to Prince Rupert from California with a copy of Tom Robbins's Even Cowgirls Get the Blues in my jacket pocket. The journey was a crash course in Cascadian ways for a New Englander naturally bent toward the old world. There was a lure in the sense of freshness and impermanence. This time, the only staff member on duty at the hostel was a woman in her 40s with long, sandy hair. She had a slight accent, and I asked where she was from. She said Sweden, by way of Oregon. An easiness filled the space between us, like we were old housemates, because I was the only guest in the dorms. I floated in and out of the common room, snacking nervously and flipping through books. I imagined that being Scandinavian made her sympathetic to my strange ambition. "What are you doing with all this stuff?" she had asked me in the afternoon, when I kept returning outside for more. Heaped on the wood floor were a backpack with a shotgun strapped to it, an orange polyethylene sled, wooden snowshoes, a ballistic nylon duffel bag, and a pair of Norwegian expedition skis with a stern portrait of explorer Roald Amundsen emblazoned in red on each tip. "I'm skiing across Canada," I said. Walking the dark streets of Prince Rupert that night was something that I had long been waiting for. For some reason, the town had a haunting magnetism, and I wondered whether this expedition was not simply an excuse for me to go back to it, back to a place that felt like it might fall off the map, cease to exist. Why was I drawn to such places, especially if they were cold and rain-soaked? Even now, I know I must return. To think about it pulls me there. It's like a gray autumn day, saturated with a sense of loss, but infinitely rich. Prince Rupert is said to outrain every place on Earth. Sarah DeLue, Canadian author of a collection of essays on northern British Columbia towns, has written a dismal homage to this one. "The rainfall in Prince Rupert," she writes, "is unparalleled, but it does not drown monsters." There was something desperate on the night air. I felt the damp snap of wind against my skin. It carried the disquiet of cold mountains and deep ocean. I looked over the water at darkness. Prince Rupert, like so many northern places, must be felt to be believed. At a distance, it is hard for me to think there is actually such a place. And then I will jump ahead to, so what I'm trying to show here is, I started with this sort of feeling. I was kind of sick of the human race, and I wanted to get away from people for a while. And here I am, going into this wild place, and I've got this like I'm stepping onto a blank slate, and then I'm going to trace a line across it with my own 2 feet on skis. And eventually, I'm able to sort of resolve the tension or the conflict between these two things. And so let me give some context for this next passage. So now I've skied for months, and I am in northeastern Manitoba, about to cross into Saskatchewan, and I'll show you a map of my route in a minute. And spring is coming on, and I found myself kind of high and dry. I'm skiing fairly close to a road, and I come to this road, and all the snow has melted in the area. And what snow is left is very sticky and it's not easy to ski. So I decided that I'm going to hitchhike until the next town where I have a contact. I'm going to spend some time there. So I was picked up by a van full of women. Almost. The driver was a male, and there were about 8 or 9 native women who'd come from a reservation in about 3 hours north, and they were on a grocery run. So they were driving to the town of Flin Flon, Manitoba, which is 3.5 hours away, and it was the nearest grocery store. And they had one spot left in the van, so they picked me up and threw all my gear into the back. As we drove east in the spring-like afternoon, I looked out the window and imagined being left alone anywhere out there. The idea didn't scare me. I thought back to that first moment when the cab driver from Terrace had dropped me off at the mouth of the Copper River. I had seen the endless wilderness stretching out in front of me and felt uncontrollably disquieted. That feeling was alien to me now, not because I had become a master of bushcraft, but because I had learned that most of the time you could survive by simply putting one foot in front of the other and not stopping until you got to a safe place, and that the energy available to drive this mind-numbing process was nearly endless once you knew how to tap it. What was becoming equally alien, however, was whatever impulse had pushed me to strike out into the winter in the first place. Looking back, I wonder if this is the way a life takes its shape, with a thesis and an antithesis fighting back and forth inside of each one of us, until a synthesis finally emerges that is able to hold the center. I loved cold and solitude, but I also loved this warm van load of people. All right, so those are my readings. What I'm going to do now, if I have time, Julie, I'm going to jump over to some slides.
Oh yeah, hold on, just
and show you a few images. So let me.
There you go. You should be able to
share the screen.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just get them queued up here. Okay, go back here for a minute. Okay, let's try that. Okay, can you see that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So this is a map. So when I envisaged this journey in the comfort of my apartment in Italy at the time, I thought I would ski all the way across Canada, from the Pacific to Quebec City, which is where the St. Lawrence becomes estuarial, and so I thought that would count as the Atlantic. I wasn't sure initially which direction I was going to go in, and for a number of reasons, I chose to start in the west. Part of it was to do with grizzlies going into hibernation in the fall, and fear of them coming out early in the springtime and eating me. So, but anyway, it became apparent after a couple of weeks of skiing that there was no way I was going to make it all the way across the continent in one winter, and certainly not if I wanted to stop and meet people and enjoy the experience. So what you see here is my track. So it roughly follows the 55th parallel, as you can see on the upper left-hand side. This is the city of Bergamo, where I used to live and now still live part-time. It's in northern Italy. It's about an hour north of Milan at the foot of the Alps. This is Vancouver, the Vancouver bus station, when I had first arrived in the West and was about to take a boat over to Vancouver Island and then a bus up the length of Vancouver Island and then another boat to Prince Rupert. You can see that I had a lot of stuff. Most of this actually stayed with me, but some of it I discarded quickly, mostly mailed at home or took it to thrift stores in towns that I would come to. But I ended up hauling about 120 pounds throughout the winter. This is me taking that second boat up the inside passage, and this is the view. And just as I was about to arrive in Prince Rupert, suddenly it cleared, and it was a radiant late fall day. This is jumping ahead to Terrace, which is the first town inland from Prince Rupert that I came to. This is where I actually started skiing. So from Prince Rupert, Prince Rupert is on the coast, and being the northwest coast, it doesn't really snow much. So I had to get about 90 miles inland before I met snow. And so this is where I put my skis on and headed into the mountains that are right in front of you, which was kind of a daunting.
Uh-oh. What's going on?
And I dodged. Oh, this is going up. It was kind of like going up steps, and this is looking back west towards Terrace and eventually the Pacific. This was a scary moment. An avalanche, a big powder avalanche, had just discharged off the side of this mountain, which had a lot more snow on it a few seconds before. And I had to dig out my camera, and so this was a couple of minutes after it had fallen and the snow was starting to settle again. But I was about to ski across this slope. So in a way it was good that it had discharged, but at the same time it was very scary, and it was also close to dark. Here I was lucky enough one night to find a cabin, and it was kind of a summer camp facility, and there were these, basic hollow cabins they weren't furnished inside, and they didn't have electricity or anything like that, but still it was better than a tent. And the locals gave it to me to spend the night in while I was waiting for a ferry to cross a lake into some remoter country. I mentioned in that second reading that Roald Amundsen, the great Norwegian polar explorer, was on the tips of my skis, and he was always staring back at me. This is him looking rather stern, but it was kind of encouraging, actually. I'll skip through some of these. Here, this is me passing through the town of Chetwynd, which is in northeastern British Columbia. I had to cross the rail yard to get to the other side of town. A little farther on, this is the Peace River. This was the northernmost point on my trajectory, near the town of Fort St. John in far northeastern British Columbia. The Peace River actually at this point doesn't freeze because it's regulated by dams, and they're released quite often, and so the water in the upper part of the river is flowing even when it's 40 or 50 below. Northern Alberta, I came into the northern reaches of kind of where the prairie meets the boreal forest. And so I often had to ski across fields, which was a nuisance because you'd ski across the field and then you have to unpack everything, lift it over a fence, ski across another field, and repeat 100 times. This is just a grain elevator in Alberta. I like this picture because this is another one of those pictures that could be pretty much anywhere along my route. it's this quintessentially northern scene. This was kind of what the end of my days when I was near settled places looked like. You'd have the sun setting in the west and throwing its glow across to the eastern sky, and then the moon rising. And there's always this low winter light. This was the next morning, looking over Lesser Slave Lake, which is in Alberta. There'll be some more lake shots in a minute. This was a cabin in Saskatchewan that belonged to an interesting character who's in the book, whose nickname was the Cossack, a guy by the name of Don Skopik, who was a Ukrainian Canadian. I won't tell you too much about him, but he's a character. And these are some of the, I think they're some of the most interesting pictures, just even though flat land is usually regarded as boring, but very few people have seen expanses of snow like some of these places. So this is a lake in northern Saskatchewan called Lac Laurent. It's one of the biggest lakes in a province that has some very big lakes. And what you have here is a pressure ridge. So some of you who are winter outdoors enthusiasts may know what a pressure ridge is, but so these are formed when two massive sheets of ice collide, kind of like tectonic plates in subduction zones. They crash together and send up these long ridges that can be miles long. And sometimes they can be dangerous because you'll often have an open lead and exposed water on one side of them, so you kind of have to be careful when you're crossing them. This again is Lac Laurent. So it's like this polar landscape, because sometimes you couldn't see the shore. This lake took me about 3 days to cross. And this is my backtrack. And what you see on the horizon is an island, not the mainland. The thing about traveling on lakes is that even the slightest breath of wind, there's no obstruction, so it can make it really cold. Usually when I hear people talk about wind chill, I kind of like blow it off. But on a lake, it makes a big difference. This picture I've included because it shows an interesting feature of my skis, if anyone is a cross-country skier. So you may know that usually when you're skiing uphill, you have what are called climbing skins, which are these pieces of fabric that have a nap that runs, it's backward oriented so that you can slide forward but not backward, and it enables you to move uphill without sliding downhill on your skis. But you tend to move very slowly when you're using climbing skins. So what I had for my skis were these half-length climbing skins that just fit under my feet, so that because the ski is cambered or curved, when you're moving forward, your feet lift off the ground, and only when you apply pressure does that middle part of the ski touch the ground. And so you get traction from that part, from that skin that's under there. But otherwise you can move forward pretty quickly. And so that was essential for hauling this heavy load. And these are just a few final pictures that were taken of people along the way and that I was able to get my hands on. This is what my camp looked like. Every night I slept in this tent. There are plenty of moments where I interact with other people in the book, and I spend a few days here and there in a town, usually with people who have invited me, who've met me out on the trail. But this was my camp. It was quite a chore setting this up because the snow was usually deep, and so you've got to sort of tamp down a platform, which would take me the better part of an hour most nights before I could actually get this tent up. And then I would have to spend a couple of hours every evening melting snow into water for that night's dinner, but also to drink the following day. So I would melt it and then pour it into a heavy duty thermos, and that would be my water for 24 hours. My father joined me for the last 4 days of the journey. This is him. And then here I am just about to wind things down. I think at this point, we can move to some questions, if that's if that's okay, unless you'd like me to talk about any other
No,
part
I
of the
think this
journey.
is a great, yeah, I think this is a great point to kind of open it up. And will anyone who's not familiar with Zoom, there is a chat feature where you can type in a question and I can read it, or we can open it up to people talking. You just kind of need to like wave at me so I can unmute you. It's always really fun. I actually did want to ask a question just to kind of get started, and you know, perhaps you do cover it in the book, but what pushed you to maybe decide to actually get this published, as opposed to maybe just, you know, writing it down to give to family or, you know, a future generation, and actually think, you know, people will want to buy this?
Well, I've long wanted to write a book. I write for a living. I write magazine articles mostly. But if it had just been that was kind of a dilemma for you know, 8 years have passed since I made this journey, and so you know, it's a bit of a gap between when I made the journey and when I published the manuscript. And when I first wrote it, it was basically just it was just a description of the ski trip, kind of linear and not in I thought, yeah, this isn't really worth publishing, so I had put it aside for a while to let it sort of ferment and see what happened. But meanwhile, I had all these things happening in my life that were a consequence of the journey itself. I don't want to give too much away, but my wife and I were separated, and I was kind of feeling restless and a lot of things. But there was something in, I knew that the journey somehow held, or the story of the journey has somehow held the key to sort of getting out of the mire that I was in. And so I revisited this description of the journey and tried to weave some of that into it. And I don't know, I thought it was a story worth telling. Winter is a central metaphor. It's not just the backdrop of the story.
Yeah. All right. Well, we do have a question from the chat. So one of our guests is wondering, how many days were you out, and asking if the 40 degrees was night temperature, but that must be 40 degrees during the day and negative at night.
I think that's what the question means.
Okay.
I'm assuming some negative. So how many days was I out? So I set off. I left Prince Rupert on November the 19th, and I stopped. My last day skiing was March 15th. So basically 4 months. Now I wasn't out that entire time. So where I was skiing is, we Americans usually call it Northern Canada. Canadians tend to call it the near north. So it's kind of like in the boreal belt of Canada. It's quite sparsely populated, but not unpopulated. So, you know, you'd have a town maybe every 100 miles or so. So I'd kind of, you know, once a week, more or less, I'd come to a town, sometimes more, in Alberta, for example. And I'd often meet people, and it's not normal, obviously, to meet some guy out skiing, trying to ski across the continent. And so conversations tend to get started, and the next thing you know, you're invited to someone's place to spend the night. So it would often happen that in a town I'd spend a night somewhere, sometimes 2 or 3 nights. But most of that time I was traveling and sleeping in my tent. Negative 40 would have been, that would be an overnight temperature, but it could get close to, I mean, in the morning it would be that cold sometimes. That was the colder end of things. I think the coldest temperature while I was that winter, that in a place where I was 45 below. But I think the coldest night I actually slept out was 37, which is still quite cold.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much the sleeping, it was getting up in the morning.
Yeah. Well, Carol would like to ask a question. So Carol, I'm going to unmute you. You might have to press something on your end. Let's see here. Yeah, there you go.
Hi, Carol. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Anders. We know Anders because our daughter's married to his brother, and we see David and Mega there too. So we're in the UK in Manchester, and it's great to hear and see Anders and his. We've been waiting for this book with great anticipation for 8 years. And fantastic achievement. I am envious of his achievement, and it's something that many people would love to write a book. And I'm really looking forward to reading it because of Anders' character. He's very insightful. He's very reflective, and he's very knowledgeable. And I'm sure it will be really interesting. I'm reminded of a British explorer called Jonathan Rayburn, who is a sailor, a yachtsman, who has travelled in America extensively. He sailed down the Mississippi in an aluminium skiff, and he sailed up the inner passage in a yacht to Juneau. And he writes in a way that I imagine Anders probably writes, a lot of reflection, a lot of insight, probably some degree of exposure. I don't know. Interested to see what Anders says about himself, but it's very, very interesting and engaging. And I think the best travel writers really reflect back to us who we are as people ourselves. And so thanks, Anders, for putting yourself out there.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you for the compliment. I probably reveal more than Jonathan Rayburn does, but I do not write as well as Jonathan Rayburn does. But thank you for the compliment, and I hope you like it.
Thank you.
I'm very intrigued, Anders, but it's something I would never ever do. So I will get vicarious pleasure from it, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, people ask. You may have asked me this, whether I would do it again, and the answer is, well, I mean, it's kind of a silly question because, you know, one is never in the same circumstances twice. But if the idea has no appeal for me now, the idea of spending an entire winter living outside and skiing. I love skiing. I love hiking and camping in the summertime. But I've had my fill of living outside in the winter.
So we've got a couple more questions in the chat. Kate is wondering, did you see animals often?
Did I see animals often? Sorry, I was looking at, there was another question in the chat. I did see animals often. Usually when people ask that question, they mean, you know, big animals that people don't see often. Of course, I saw lots of squirrels and, you know, snowshoe hares and things like that. And I saw a lot of moose, particularly in northeastern British Columbia. And I think in one day between Chetwynd, British Columbia, and Fort St. John, I probably saw 40 moose, sort of a moose corridor. I saw a fisher, which you don't see every day. I saw one wolf, a few coyotes and foxes, but not a lot. You know, animals are more sensible. They try to stay in warm places when it's cold. There's another question I see in the chat. Have you ever been back to visit some of the places along your journey in the years since? I have, as a matter of fact. It's in British Columbia, not in the other places. A year or two later, during that sort of restless period that I described, I went and spent a summer working as a tree planter in northern British Columbia, and I was very close to some of the places I'd been, and I was able to rekindle a few of the friendships that I'd kind of begun to make while I was there the first time. And then there's another question: were there any really dangerous moments? And also, how did you navigate with a very detailed map or just compass, GPS, etc.? Yeah, I mean, of course, you could make the case that every moment is dangerous when it's that cold and you're outside, far from people, in contact with the world. But I understand what you mean. And so that night that I spent at the bottom of that slope after the avalanche was probably quite dangerous. And then there's a moment, and I won't tell you about it because it's kind of a crux of the book in a way. I was lost on a fairly large lake in Saskatchewan in a blizzard. And that was the one time that I thought I might die. And how did you navigate? Sorry, I read the question already. I used a compass and paper maps. I'm not very technologically inclined, and so I didn't have a GPS. So I had little shrunken down Canadian Geological Survey maps that I printed out in advance, and a compass, and that was it. And what are your thoughts on interactions with First Nation peoples? There's a lot of that in the book. That question is from my father, David Morley. There's a lot in the book. It's a tricky subject, of course. There's a lot of ugly history in North America, in Canada, and the US as well. History, unfortunately, does not have a rewind button, and so you have to kind of find a way of dealing with it with sensitivity, and I hope that I've done that. There's a lot of sadness, but there are also some bright spots. There are also some bright spots, and I've tried to put as much of that into the book as I could.
Yeah, I know that you mentioned in one of the very first stories, when you're starting out, you are on the Highway of Tears, which is
yes,
one of the more, I would say, in my experience, well-known areas for what has happened over the last 40 years. And unfortunately, it's not well investigated. So that's a very unfortunate part of the history up there, that, yeah, there's areas where these people go missing. So
yes.
Yeah.
So the Highway of Tears is a section of the Trans-Canada Highway, remote section that runs between, it's about a 400 mile, 700 kilometer section between Prince George and the West Coast, between Prince George and Prince Rupert. It's a pretty lonely 2-lane highway. And since the 60s, even the numbers are not well known because a lot of these cases aren't very well documented. But like you have all across Western and Northern US and Canada, this phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And this is sort of a hot spot for the phenomenon. Something like 50 women have gone missing, many without any trace. Like, people have no idea what became of them, just along this single highway, which is very disturbing, obviously, and sad. So, and unfortunately, you see some of this callous, I mean, as anywhere, there are ignorant people, insensitive people, and so you encounter callousness and rather blatant racism. Of course, that's something that's found everywhere, sadly, but.
So I wanted to ask a question, and it's kind of been brought up when you say you're not technologically savvy, but is there a part of you that, or, were you happy to kind of be away from technology? And granted, 7-8 years ago, it was probably even less in our lives. Like, I don't remember, well, I had just moved to Portland, but I can't go anywhere without my phone. I mean, it's basically my business hub as well. But there are times where if you're forced to, we have a friend's house on the Oregon coast where there's no cable, no internet, no nothing. And there's a moment where it's kind of like that it's taken away from you, and it's nice. Like, you're forced to not be relying on it. Did you feel that way when you were planning this?
A little bit, although I have to say that I've kind of made my normal life as much like that as possible. Less so since then. I was much more sort of absolutist in my Luddism before the journey. I've mellowed since then, and I do have a smartphone and things like that. But at the time I didn't. I had a little, one of those little Nokia pocket phones. I didn't want to take any kind of communication device with me, but my wife persuaded me to bring a satellite phone, which I seldom turned on, but I did have it just in case.
That's good. I mean, obviously there probably wasn't a lot of places to charge it. So, I mean, you have to keep the battery or
Exactly.
it's not
Yeah.
helpful for you. So, well, this has been great. If there are any further questions, please let me know. I just want to remind everyone that the book is available for purchase at our store. You can call ahead and get one. We can ship to anywhere in the US, unfortunately, probably not to the UK. But this is possibly the most geographically reaching event that we've done. So it's so amazing to have people, you know, a continent away joining our little bookstore in Bend, Oregon. We just celebrated our 4th anniversary, and we're just hoping to keep those years stacking up with everything that's going on right now and stores being closed. We're just so thankful that people are here to support our store. And again, thank you so much, Anders, for taking the time. I know it's a little bit late there where you are, but it's just been so great to learn about this book, and I'm really excited to keep reading it.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you all for coming. I'll just say one thing. Speaking of the continental reach, there was also my brother, who was mentioned by his in-laws there, actually lives in Oregon, in Baker City, Oregon.
Oh, wow.
But he was sucked. He was going to come today, but then it snowed in the mountains, and he decided to bail and go skiing instead. Which I suppose is in keeping with the spirit, is in the spirit of the book.
Just in the spirit of independent bookshops, we have a great relationship with the Betty's Books in Baker, and they regularly buy us books for our family who've encamped there for the last few years, and they're very helpful. They deliver books to the house and wrap them up for us. So long live independent bookshops, and we have our own
indeed
bookshop here in Manchester, which keeps us going through COVID and lockdown. And all power to you. Thanks very much, Julie.
Yes, thank you so much. It was so wonderful to spend this hour with everyone. So yeah, you know, please join us. We have events happening, you know, all year long. Check our event calendar. But as always, just keep reading. It's what's going to keep all of us sane during this time. So here he goes. Look at
Just on a final note, what is a fisher? Anders,
I'm sorry.
you didn't answer my question. What is a fisher?
Oh, I'm sorry. A fisher is an animal in the weasel family. You know, if you know what a marten is, a fisher is one step up from a marten. It's a little bit bigger than a marten. It's smaller than a wolverine, smaller than a badger.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Beautiful animals, and they move much more gracefully on the snow than humans.
Isn't that great?
All right. Well, everyone, have a great rest of your weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thanks, Julie.
Yes, thank you for putting this on. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
You're gonna stay?
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.